I have one question for you, Bryan. What the hell is going on? And I really have been looking forward to talking to you
Yeah.
and almost having a therapy session with you, if you will.
Well, I think your question frames the moment we're in really perfectly. Throughout most of American history, we have been silent about the harms of our history, about all of the damage that was done, about the false narratives that we embraced to justify the displacement of millions of Native people when Europeans arrived. There were millions of indigenous peoples here before Europeans arrived. We wanted their land, we wanted this. And so even though we created a constitution that talked about equality and liberty and justice for all, we didn't apply those concepts to Native people. We instead created this narrative of racial difference. And I think that was like an infection that took root in America. And behind that kind of misguided narrative where we said that Native people are savages, indigenous peoples are not like the rest of us, so we don't have to extend to them equality, liberty, and justice, and we can force them off their land, and we can reduce their population, and we can do all of these terrible things. That same narrative was used to justify 246 years of slavery. And I continue to believe that the great evil of slavery wasn't the forced labor, the bondage, the violence, the cruelty. That was horrific. I think the greatest evil of slavery was the narrative that was created to justify enslavement. Because people who enslaved other people didn't want to think of themselves as immoral or indecent or unchristian. And how do you think of yourself as a decent person when you see mothers being pulled away from their screaming children, knowing those mothers will never see those children again because you chose to sell them? How do you think of yourself as decent when you see the cruelty and the violence? Well, you need a narrative. And we created a false narrative that Black people aren't as good as white people, that Black people are less capable, less worthy, less human, less evolved. And that narrative of racial difference was the great evil of slavery in America. And it outlasted the Civil War. The North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war, because after the Civil War, even our commitment to use law to protect formerly enslaved people failed. The 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal protection to formerly enslaved people, the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to vote, were quickly abandoned by our U.S. Supreme Court and other court legal institutions who sided with states' rights over the U.S. Constitution. And that's what led to that century of violence and lynching. It's what led to Jim Crow. It's what led to racial segregation. It led to the silence about this history in our textbooks and schools. It led to bias against other immigrant groups when they came to this country, Asian people, even ethnic minorities like the Irish and the Italians were initially targeted until they adopted whiteness or adopted an identity that wasn't other, wasn't racially different. And that was our history and continued to be our history. And I think the consequences of that are really painful. We did horrific things to Black and brown people. Millions of Black people had to flee their homes in the first half of the 20th century because of terror violence that raged uncontrolled throughout the American South. They went to Chicago and Cleveland and Detroit and Los Angeles and Oakland, not as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities, but as refugees and exiles from terror violence in the American South. And they weren't entirely welcome in those places, and they were put in what you could call the equivalent of a refugee camp. And we see the footprints of those camps in south side of Chicago and East St. Louis and poor neighborhoods across the urban North and West. They abandoned lands that they owned and therefore were denied the opportunity to create wealth for their children and their grandchildren. And we have a wealth gap in America today that is rooted in the displacement of millions of Black families who could have used their land to create wealth, but were denied that because we didn't commit to their constitutional rights. In the 50s and 60s, you began to see some organizing to push back against that, and the heroic civil rights movement tore down the legal architecture of racial segregation, of that narrative of racial difference. But the idea was still with us. The practice was still with us.
The cultural conditioning.
The cultural conditioning, that's exactly right. And so for the last 60 and 70 years, we've been continuing to experience those harms. And when women and people of color got into the workforce, got into places they had historically been excluded, and they outperform their white male counterparts, they should have been promoted, they should have been celebrated. But because of these narratives, we didn't trust women and people of color to have the leadership positions they deserve because they were more skilled, and we denied them those opportunities. And so then we began to realize that that wasn't right. That wasn't fair. And that was the genesis behind DEI. That's when we started to say, oh, you know what? It's wrong to not put the most skilled person in the position of leadership just because she's a woman or because this person is Black or brown. And that was an effort to begin repairing the harm that is connected to this narrative of racial difference.
But I think, Bryan, a lot of people thought, well, don't put the less skilled person just because they are a minority in that position. I think that's how so many people interpreted
That's right.
DEI efforts.
That's right. And I think we have to fault the corporate bodies and the institutions that started implementing these policies, because what they should have said is, we have done wrong. We've had lots of women in our workforce. We've had lots of people of color in our workforce who were more skilled, and yet they were passed over for promotion. They weren't given leadership opportunities because of their race, because of their gender. We made that mistake. We did something wrong. And now we're going to repair that by committing to correcting that cultural conditioning. But they didn't want to admit that they had done things in a bad way. They didn't want to confront, they didn't want to embrace the wrong. They didn't want to say, we backed it poorly. I got on a plane recently, and I was sitting next to someone, and the pilot came on. The pilot was a woman. The co-pilot was a Black man. And the person sitting next to me turned to me and said, "Oh my God, did you see who the pilot and co-pilot is?" And I said, "I did." He said, "Wow, this is going to be a really scary flight. You know they're not skilled and qualified to fly this plane."
Come on.
I kid you not.
Someone said that to you,
Said
a
it
Black
to,
man?
yes, that's exactly right.
What?
And I said to him, I said, "Oh, sir, when I saw that woman and I saw that pilot, I actually relaxed because I knew that they were likely more skilled than most other pilots, because for an airline to give them this opportunity, they had to outperform their counterparts." That's been my experience, is that you actually have to do a little bit better when you're a person of color, when you're a woman. And so I actually feel more comfortable than I would ordinarily feel.
And what did he say?
He just looked at me. He said, "Well, I never thought about it like that." But that is the consequence of corporate institutions not saying, we failed. We did something wrong. We did discriminate. We did not give the most skilled person the job because of their gender and their race. And now we're going to commit to doing that. And so instead of it being presented as a gimme to unqualified, less skilled people because of their race and gender, it was actually a remedy for harm that was done to people because of their race and gender. And we don't like owning up to the mistakes we made. And that's the same thinking that was shaping other cultural institutions. Educational bodies, textbook writers should have said, we failed. We did something wrong by not talking honestly about the history of America. And now we're going to try to correct that by having more comprehensive, more inclusive language and text in our books. We've disfavored people because of their race and gender. We skipped that part, and we embraced this moment of response without acknowledging the harm. 2020 was a very powerful example of that. You saw police violence manifesting in ways that made it undeniable that there's a problem. When Ahmaud Arbery was shot while jogging, when Breonna Taylor was killed, when George Floyd was killed, people were saying, we've got to do something about this. And I wanted police departments to say, you're right. We've got a lot of officers that presume people are dangerous and guilty because of their race, because of their color. You're right. We need to fix a problem we have of presuming dangerousness and guilt based on race. But instead, we just talked about, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And then as the cultural environment shifted, there was this big pushback against it. And people thought people who didn't deserve things were getting things that they don't deserve, when in fact, we were addressing longstanding problems that have long existed. I went to Harvard Law School. I've got a lot of degrees and awards. I've won cases at the US Supreme Court, and I've been in courtrooms representing clients, getting there early, sitting at defense counsel's table, where the judge will walk in and immediately get mad at me. The judge will look at me and say, hey, you get back out there in the hallway. I don't want any defendants sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. And I have to stand up and say, well, I'm sorry, Your Honor. I am the lawyer. I didn't introduce myself. My name is Bryan Stevenson. I have to try to de-escalate this situation. And I was doing that recently. I was in a courtroom in the Midwest, and the judge started laughing, but it wasn't an apologetic laugh. And it kind of angered me. And the prosecutor started laughing. They thought it was so funny. And I was sitting there getting angry. And then I thought, oh no, Bryan, you can't get angry. You need to smile. You may need to laugh. And I felt that way. I thought that way because my client was not going to be able to leave that county. I was able to leave that county and never come back based on the way I was treated if I chose to do that. But my client was going to have to stay there. So when they were laughing, I smiled. And then I eventually chuckled. Client came in, we did the hearing. But I remember sitting in my car after that hearing thinking, wow, here I am, this middle-aged Black man. I'm in my best suit. I actually argued the case at the Supreme Court that we were trying to implement. I've got all of these degrees and awards, and I'm still required to laugh at my own humiliation to do justice for my client. That's not right. That's not fair. And I'm getting old enough to know that when you have to constantly navigate presumptions of dangerousness and guilt because of your color, when you have to tell your children how to survive a police encounter, what to do and what not to do, how they can't do the things that their white friends can do because they're going to be burdened with this presumption, when you have to constantly navigate this world, it's exhausting. And I want something better. I want something better for everybody. And that's why the commitment to truth-telling, the commitment to building institutions that help us understand the harms of history is such a priority. It's why we were making necessary progress in 2018. And I think some people, again, misinterpreted it. We opened our sites, and I talk a lot about this. And I think sometimes when people hear me talking about slavery and lynching and segregation, they think I want to punish America for this history. I have no interest in punishment. My interest is liberation. My interest is getting us to get to the point where we are unburdened by this history. I want the children of my grandchildren and their children to be born into a country where they're not presumed dangerous or guilty because of their race. I want us to get to the point where we're not breathing in the pollution created by this long history of racial injustice that we just haven't addressed, and so it's still with us. I want us to get past that fear that is everywhere because we have these unaddressed problems created by our history.